everyone, my name is Steph. This is the Noveltea Corner and welcome to another Psy-Changeling video. This week we are going to be talking about Shield of Winter, which is book 13 in the Psy-Changeling series. If you are new here, I am filming a book by book video on every book in this series. I'm also one of the co-hosts for the Psy-Changeling Readathon here on YouTube. We are currently reading 3 books every month and talking about them at the end of the month in a live show. I will leave all the details down below, so if you'd like to join us, you absolutely can. There's also a Discord group where we're talking about all of the books as well, so feel free to come and join us. Shield of Winter is one of the books that we are reading in May, and we are reading the final 3 books in the first series, so Shield of Winter, Shards of Hope, and Allegiance of Honor. This was really fun to go back and reread because ironically this has a scene in it that I'm constantly going back and referring to just because I think it's hilarious, which I'll talk about later on. But I haven't actually reread it since I read it the first time. So this was great to go back and read it from start to finish. And this is also quite a bit longer than some of the other ones. So in this story, we have the relationship between 2 Psy characters. So if you're unfamiliar with the world, this is a world where you have humans, you have changelings, and you have Psy. Psy have mental abilities. And this is the first of, well, I don't know necessarily if it's the first of the Arrows books, because technically Judd is an Arrow, but at the time when we get Judd's stories, he's no longer an Arrow. But we follow Vasek, who is the teleporter, who we have been seeing pop in and out, quite literally, of books since the very beginning of the series. And he's a natural born teleporter, so he can travel anywhere he wants, whenever he wants, however far he wants, without strain to his powers, because that's just what innately his body is designed to do. And we have learnt in previous books that something is not quite right with Vasek. He is struggling quite a bit, and his best friend Aiden, who is currently in charge of the Arrows, has been trying to limit some of the jobs that he's doing. And it is Vasek's relationship with an empath called Ivy Jane. So I'm going to put this book down because it's big and heavy and I'm not going to hold it for the whole video, but I will put a picture on the screen. This book opens in 2081 and silence has just fallen at the end of the previous book, Heart of Obsidian, when Caleb decreed it so. They needed silence to fall because the net was beginning to become infected by a disease, and they believe that silence is the cause of it because they're suppressing all of their emotions. At the beginning of the book, there is a discussion between Vasek and Aiden around this infection in the net, and also we have Caleb pointing out that he believes that the E's are the ones who are going to be able to help save the net. And so he has come up with this plan to voluntarily recruit empaths who have traditionally been told that they're defective or rehabilitated or shunned from Psy society because their powers are entirely related to emotions, which they haven't, really allowed in the last 100 years. He wants them to volunteer to be trained to try and combat this infection in the net. And he wants to use the Arrows to help keep them safe and to protect them while they're doing this training. Aiden assigns Vasek as the Arrow coordinator for the group of Arrows who will be supporting the E's, and the process by which they will have a squad whose sole purpose is to protect the E's, and it will be on a one-to-one basis. So each empath will have their own Arrow as a bodyguard slash helper slash etc. Aiden gives Vasek this job because he is trying to keep him from more violent jobs, because he's worried Vasek is kind of going off the deep end and might end up killing himself either on a job or for whatever reason. So he wants him in this role where he's pretty much a support role and a coordinator. And they're also not sure what kind of effect the empaths are going to have on the Arrows. And the Arrows are soldiers of the Psy. They're very, very powerful telekinetics usually, who have combat capabilities, who have been specially trained to be assassins and like the Black Ops soldiers of this world. Also, while he's coordinating the Arrows in the squad, Vasek has also been assigned his own empath, and that is Ivy Jane. When Vasek goes to recruit Ivy Jane, he goes and visits her on this farm, I think it's in Montana, where Ivy Jane lives sort of off the grid, off the Psynet grid, with her parents Gwen and Carter. Her parents voluntarily removed themselves from a lot of the Psy machinations when she was a teenager because basically her powers went haywire, probably because of her empath abilities, and she voluntarily opted for reconditioning, but when she was reconditioned, it was done so badly, it left her broken, and she was basically a shell of her former self. So they took her and moved well away from a lot of the Psy population, and now they live on this farm. So when he arrives there, he presents the letter from Caleb to Ivy and lets her know that it is optional and they would really like her to be there. He also meets her dog Rabbit, who becomes a very prominent figure in this book, and we love Rabbit. Rabbit is amazing. And then Vasek leaves and he lets her sit with the idea, and she's sort of talked herself into accepting it because she wants to see if something can be made of her powers, if she can salvage some part of herself that she lost all those years ago. But she hasn't told Vasek that yet. Vasek then visits his grandfather Zyzen, and if his name sounds familiar, it's because he's the genetic father of Keenan, who is Amara's son, who we met back in... am I going to remember the name of the book? It's Dorian's book, Hostage to Pleasure. And it turns out that Zyzen is Vasek's great-grandfather, although most people just call him grandfather as a sign of respect because Zyzen is very well respected amongst the Psy. And Vasek is talking to him about this new role that he has and about how they're going to be training the empaths. And then Zyzen talks a lot about the initiation of silence and the silence protocol way back when, and how it impacted Zyzen and also his wife, Sunny, who was an empath at the time, which Vasek didn't know anything about. So there's this lovely thread of continuity in here for comparison. And Zyzen is a great character. He's just sort of this grandfatherly figure for the whole rest of the series. Ivy is then attacked on her property by a member of Pure Psy who are trying to take out the E's because they don't believe that E's are a true designation and that they're the reason why silence has fallen. And Vasek ends up saving her and stopping her attackers, who he then teleports to Aiden, who puts them in prison as opposed to killing them, which is something the Arrows might have done in the past. But they're beginning to realize that they actually need to gather more information about their enemies, so they get thrown in prison. As everything's being set up for this settlement of E's where they're going to be trained, Vasek meets with the Arrows who have been assigned to the group. Two of them, from memory, are Abbott and Nerida, and a whole group of others, and they basically give them the opportunity to opt out because, as I said at the start, no one really knows how the empaths are going to affect the Arrows, who are deeply silent. For good reason, because their powers are very unstable and very unpredictable at times. Pretty much all of them opt to stay within this new program and to work with the E's, and then we get to know a little bit more about these characters as the story goes on. There's also a meeting between Vasek and Aiden, and as well as Hawk and Indigo. I think Judd's there, probably Lucas, because Caleb has asked the Changelings if they can use some of the land on the border between the Snowdancer and Dark River territory to house the E's and to keep them safe. And so there's this little part of land that they're granted, and they discuss how they're going to keep the E's inside. So they've set up lots of security perimeters for the safety of both the E's and also the Changelings. And also the Changelings build all of the housing in this area so that it's in line with the things that they want in their territory. So Ivy agrees to be part of this group, and so she's teleported into this new settlement area. I'm going to call it a settlement because it just feels like it, but it's a little enclave sort of community area. And I'm going to read off the names of all of the E's because some of them come up time and time again. So there's Chang, who is a cardinal, Conchetta, Leanne, Terry, Jaya, Deshan, Pen, Brigitte, and Isaiah. And initially Ivy struggles to connect with them, and this really unsettles her, and so she confides that in Vasek, and she begins to spend more time with Vasek as a result. And so she's trying to work through her own feelings about being in a new place with new people and how she thought it would go smoother than it was because they all have something in common. But as it turns out, everyone's got their own hang-ups. And part of the reason that they've tried to put all of these E's together is that whenever a Psy physically moves their location in the world, their location in the Psy-net also relocates. So if it's a permanent change, they'll permanently relocate to that part of the Psy-net. And by putting them all in this one space, Caleb and the Arrows are planning on redirecting some of the infection to that part of the net to see what the E's can do to help control or stop or fix this infection. And so everyone knows that. It's been laid out. It's all very clear that that's what their role is. Very early on into her time in this new location, Ivy's mental locks completely fracture. So when she was reconditioned in her teens, it was so badly done that basically everything was cobbled together to kind of protect her mind. And the final lock on that just completely fails, and she's on the verge of dying. And Vasek teleports Aiden in, who is able to help. Aiden is a medic, but he also is a very powerful telepath. And so he's able to sort of stop that fracturing and to build some rudimentary shielding to keep her alive. And then later on they bring Sasha in to work with her to rebuild her shields. Shortly after that, Leanne and her arrow guardian are attacked while in the compound by someone who teleports in, and her arrow guardian is wounded significantly. And then Vasek finds out that Leanne had been sending photos of the surroundings where she was now living to her family, and that enabled the teleporter to get a lock to come in. And so Vasek confronts the head of Leanne's family. Leanne is removed from the compound because part of the agreement they signed was that they would not reveal their location to anyone else for the safety of everyone. And so that was broken. And then Vasek has to use his telekinetic powers, which he's quite a strong telekinetic, to reshape the landscape around the cabins and the settlement where everyone's living. He literally tears trees out and moves boulders and changes what the cabins all look like by removing verandas and bits and pieces, because he doesn't know how far the photos have spread. Judd contacts him in the middle of it because the changelings know that something big is going on and asks if Vasek needs any help, and so he comes in and he also helps him with this reshaping of the settlement. After that, Hawk, who is in wolf form, visits this settlement with Judd, and there's a very cute scene where Rabbit basically sits in front of Wolf Hawk because he's like protecting his territory, and it's great. And Hawk just kind of looks at him, this tiny little dog, a tiny little thing of a dog. And Ivy witnesses them talking to Vasek, and she's very intrigued by the changelings and also by Judd. And then later on, she compares the way that the arrows function as a team to the way that the changelings function as a pack. And I thought that was a really apt description because they really do function in the same way as a pack. They're very protective of one another. They work together really well. And once you're an arrow, you're always considered an arrow, particularly if you are willing to put your life on the line for everyone else. As I said, Sasha comes to visit Ivy to help rebuild her shield, and she confides in Sasha that she is very intrigued by Vasek, and they end up talking about Vasek and Judd and Caleb because they're the main Psy heroes from the previous books, and how they're all different and how they can be intimidating but closed off and whatnot. And Sasha's obviously spent a little bit more time around all of them, so she's able to offer some insight. And one of the key things that sort of starts to draw Ivy and Vasek closer together is that because Ivy has not really been silent for a long time, she's used to things like eating normal food and having things that taste really good, and so she often makes food and then offers to share it with Vasek, who just eats the bland Psy protein bar things that they all seem to like. And she does things like heat up the protein drinks and whatnot, even though they don't need to be heated, and she does it because she's worried that Vasek is going to be cold or that it might be a form of comfort. And so she's constantly doing all of these things to try and earn Vasek's trust and to get to know him better, and it's all very sweet. Aiden makes the observation that many of the arrows who are working with ease have begun to stabilize in their powers. So a lot of the arrows are almost considered somewhat unstable because they're in a very volatile job. They're doing very dangerous things, and so their mental state has been quite fragile. Aiden comments on the fact that Abbott, who was really struggling, has stabilized while working with Jaya, and even Vasek has stabilized a lot and is a lot calmer and a lot more focused while he's around Ivy. And then we sort of begin the real true sort of lead in to the development of their relationship, because Vasek acknowledges to himself that he is sexually attracted to Ivy. And then at one point there's this hilarious scene where, without thinking this through, Ivy sends Vasek a mental picture basically flashing herself at him, and he sort of doesn't respond straight away to her about that, but he loves the image, and it's sort of one of the things that he clings to. And Ivy, of course, is horribly embarrassed that she did it, but also not, and it's great. At the same time, she's becoming closer with Jaya, who is another empath in the compound, and the two begin to explore the infection in the net on the Psy net level, and they also talk about how they've connected with their arrows. So Jaya's arrow is Abbott. I can't remember if I said that earlier. And Jaya is very fond of Abbott as well. Then we come to the first significant incident of the book. So the infection in the net is affecting certain sections of it, and when it hits a particular area, all of the Psy in the area begin to go crazy, and they become quite violent, and they start attacking each other and everyone around them. So there is an incident that sends a shockwave through the Psy net, and the arrows set up a shield to protect all of the E's within the settlement, and this shockwave is so extreme that it begins to knock many of the arrows unconscious, which makes the ability to maintain the shield a struggle. And so the E's work together to create their own shield beneath that, and it functions very differently from the shield that the arrows make, but is just as strong. And you start to see how the empaths can function together as a group, and they begin to realize how they can function as a group. The breach in the net happened at Sunshine Station, which we found out about in Devon Cartier's book, which was the original point of this infection where all of the Psy went crazy. Caleb and Aiden teleport there and have to try and shore up the Psy net there to prevent any further deaths and to prevent the Psy net from degrading further. And then there's another breach in Anchorage, and Vasek teleports there with the 2 younger arrows, and they're there trying to contain the damage. While he's there, he manages to find one survivor, a Psy teenager called Evan, who for some reason survived this Psy attack. Vasek wonders whether he's an empath, and he takes him to Ivy. And Ivy begins to work with him, and at one point she takes, as an empath, she takes his terror, and the impact and the profound nature of that is so severe for her that she ends up flaming out, because it's the first time she's done that on such a grand scale. Caleb has this moment of emotional awareness around the arrows and gives Aiden full control over the training program for future arrows. So they are aware that they will need to continue to train those Psy children who have very strong telekinetic or combat abilities, and rather than trying to take control of the arrows, Caleb relinquishes that control, the training control, to Aiden, who is much more even-tempered and more likely to do the right thing, to be honest, because Caleb's learning at the moment. Caleb is still learning, and it's great. Vasek also finds a second survivor in Anchorage, and it's a baby girl, and he manages to reunite the child with her mother, and this starts to throw up questions. Okay, why did Eben and why did this little girl survive everything that happened? Because they're Psy, they should have lost it and they didn't. So what's the common denominator? And this becomes very relevant and prevalent later on. Along with his emotional revelation, Caleb then also begins to recognize that in order to contain and work and solve these outbreaks that are occurring on the physical plane with the Psy, everyone needs to work together. So they need a group that includes humans, changelings, and Psy to work to contain these outbreaks, to talk to the media about them so that everyone can see that everyone's working together. It's Sahara who suggests that Silver Mercant head up this group because Silver is Caleb's assistant. She's very efficient. She's a great character, and it's just the type of job that she could do. It's a very high profile position, which is something that that Silver's family would recognize as being a worthwhile job, but also see that Caleb values her worth. So it's all very political. One of the thoughts that I had is that Sahara is very politically savvy. So is Caleb to an extent, but Sahara sees past just the political aspect and starts looking at the personable stuff around it, and she basically becomes his advisor, which is amazing. When Vasek returns from Anchorage, Ivy wants to know what happened there, and he's very reluctant to tell her, and Judd gives him advice that can basically be summarized as don't piss her off, just tell her. So they have that conversation. They have a moment where Vasek ends up holding Ivy, and then he asks her to send him another picture of her, another mental image of her, and she offers to show him the real thing. And so she starts stripping off her clothes, and this is the first truly sort of intimate scene that they have. And while it's happening, he loses control and he teleports them. I think he teleports them twice out of the location, and he's kind of embarrassed by it because he literally can't control himself. And she tells him it's fine because he didn't take her anywhere public, but he's just beginning to go, okay, well, how am I going to control this? All she did was take off her top. Like, that's it. And he couldn't control himself. She then asks him about the gauntlet that he had implanted in his arm. And we find out that it's failing quite badly. We knew that from the previous book. It's not working the way that it's supposed to, and that there's a 72% chance of overloading, which could potentially kill Vasek. Ivy gets very mad at Vasek for choosing to implant himself with experimental technology, and she can't understand why he valued himself so little that he would put himself at such great risk. And of course she started to fall for him, so she's really mad on that emotional level that he would do this because they've just found each other and now it's likely that it's going to kill him. So she's very, very mad at him. After this, Ivy decides that she wants to be not separated into this area in San Francisco where they're very sheltered, where she's very sheltered and safe. She actually wants to go to an infected area of the net because they've worked out that the E's have some degree of immunity to this infection in the net. So she actually wants to go to a naturally heavily infected area to see what kind of impact she will have. The other E's agree, and they all end up separating into these groups of speciality. And so 2 or 3 E's are in each group, and they end up in different locations around the world with the purpose of trying to see what impact they can have on this disease. Ivy and Jaya end up in New York City with Vasek and Abbott, and it's there that Ivy and Vasek have their first kiss. And then there's this running joke around kissing practice because practice makes perfect. So it's a very sweet scene. While they're walking around New York City, Ivy can feel the infection, and then she suddenly realizes that Abbott and Vasek, they don't have the same immunity that she has. And so she suddenly becomes very concerned that they've put themselves in this situation where they could potentially end up infected themselves. And as it turns out, Vasek and Abbott knew the risks and they were willing to take it in order to protect their E's. And there's also sort of, you begin to wonder if there's this connection between the E's and the arrows that might offer them some safety. Now that he's starting to value his life a little bit more, Vasek contacts Zai-Zen and asks for his help in trying to track down anyone who might be able to help him to either remove or disable the gauntlet in his arm. Zai-Zen turns to Ashaya and by extension Amara to ask for their help, and he also has a conversation with Keenan, which is very, very sweet. Ivy is attacked again in New York City and Vasek is able to kill the threat, and then the infection fully hits New York City and Ivy tries her best to contain the Psy who basically go insane, and it doesn't work as successfully as she would have liked. The offshoot of being involved in this sort of incident is that Jaya realizes that her specific E ability has to do with helping people who are trapped in their own minds. So she actually spends a good portion of time from here on out working in hospitals with Psy who are trapped inside their heads, which is different to what Ivy is able to do with her powers. Ivy is able to work sort of on a larger scale, but even then she still is refining what it is that she's truly capable of. We then have a scene where Zai-Zen contacts Anthony Kyriakis and asks him about what happened to Samuel Rain. Samuel Rain was the creator of the gauntlet. He was the one who, the original designer of it, who mysteriously disappeared. And as it turns out, Anthony actually has Samuel Rain because Samuel was attacked and nearly killed. And incidentally, it was Vasek who teleported this very broken, damaged man to Anthony, although Vasek didn't know who he was because he was so severely injured, and it was a split-second teleport. Anthony has had him in sort of hiding / protective custody / basically like a hospice environment since then, because Samuel is no longer the man that he once was. He's very, very broken. And Zai-Zen calls in the favour with Anthony because he wants Vasek to meet with Samuel Rain, because he wants to save his great-grandson. There's another outbreak in New York City and Ivy and Vasek end up talking with one of the survivors, Miguel. While trying to contain a lot of the incident, Ivy passes out and Vasek automatically teleports her to Sasha, which almost causes an incident between Vasek and Lucas, who's very annoyed that Vasek could teleport directly into their house because changelings. And then Vasek also suggests to Sasha that it would be a good idea for Sasha to come to New York City because of her capabilities as a cardinal Psy. When Ivy's recovered, Vasek takes her to Haven, which is where Samuel Rain is currently living. It's a haven for Psy who have nowhere else to go. And it's run by a woman called Clara, who is a former J-Psy. And Clara updates them on Samuel Rain's condition, which is basically that he doesn't seem to be aware of his previous work. And it seems to be relatively true while they're meeting with Samuel, who basically ignores Vasek. He spends a bit of time talking to Ivy, but mostly he's focused on Rabbit because they've brought Rabbit with them, and so Samuel plays with him. And then when he finally acknowledges Vasek, he basically calls him an idiot because he accepted experimental tech without knowing the true risks, or without acknowledging that the risks could be this severe. Obviously, this whole time Vasek and Ivy's relationship is becoming more pronounced, and Vasek ends up visiting with Judd, and this is one of my favorite scenes that I keep coming back to this book for because I think it's funny. And Vasek visits Judd and asks for his advice on how he can be intimate with Ivy without constantly teleporting. Judd thinks it's absolutely hilarious that Vasek is teleporting to other places. 'Cause back in Caressed by Ice, Judd was breaking furniture, but Vasek is literally teleporting them to other places. Anyway, so they have this discussion and they sort of come up with some strategies, and then Judd offers to send Vasek his research because of course the Psy have researched this. We learnt this with Caleb. I mean, bless them and their little research-based hearts. There is another outbreak in New York City. This time Sasha is there. Ivy overextends herself while trying to contain it. And then Sasha is able to initiate what's called a terminal field, which basically means she's able to create a contained space where she strips Psy of their psychic powers. And the decision is made after that that she is going to train the other Cardinal E's in how to do this, because it was something that only Cardinal E's could do. It was basically a way of stopping the riots. And so she's finally figured out how to do this, and so her job is going to be training up everyone else in how to do that. After the attack is sorted out, Vasek and Ivy are back in their apartment, and then they're attacked in the apartment again. This time, oh well, this is a bit of a content warning. So Rabbit is hurt quite badly. And actually, so is Vasek. But you know, we're mostly concerned about small, gorgeous little pets here. So Rabbit is injured and Ivy is beside herself. And so Vasek teleports them to the best veterinary MSI known to man, basically, so that Rabbit can get the best medical care. And it's a gorgeous, gorgeous scene because it shows how much Vasek is aware of this connection between Ivy and Rabbit, because Ivy found Rabbit very broken and damaged and injured when she was a teenager. And it was through helping him heal and looking after him while he was healing that she was able to begin to heal herself after her traumatic reconditioning experience. And so they have this really deep bond. And so to see Rabbit hurt was just immensely distressing for her. And then after that, Vasek and Ivy have sex for the first time, and they keep teleporting, but Vasek has started to train his mind to keep them on a loop so that they're not teleporting anywhere public. They're only teleporting to places that he knows are safe, because it's just constantly happening and it's kind of hilarious to read about. When the next outbreak happens, instead of working on the physical plane, Ivy attacks the infection on the Psy-Net, and she has much more success there. And then we find out Sahara has been investigating the connection between all the survivors of these outbreaks, and she believes that there is a connection between all of them and the E's. Vasek also accidentally becomes the face of the Arrows for the public when a photo of him rescuing a baby is released to the media, and he sort of has to be okay with that because Aiden's like, you're going to be the face of the Arrows because this is good publicity for us. We also have the start of Sahara and Ivy's friendship. So they meet when Vasek and Caleb are meeting to discuss everything that's going on, and the two begin to form this really great friendship, which is fantastic because Ivy doesn't really have anyone outside of Jaya and Vasek and the E's and the Arrows as good solid friendship groups, and Sahara and Ivy will do amazing things together because they are absolute bosses. So Sahara had this theory around all of these survivors who were connected to other E's, and then Ivy begins to test out this theory because she looks and she sees on the Psy-Net level she is connected to Vasek and to a group of other Psy who she's had close contact with, and that the people that she's had close contact with are relatively immune to the disease in the net. So she and Vasek go to visit two Arrows she's never met before to see if that same immunity will transfer to them. And when she's in their presence, it does. It translates to them, but it also means that some of the sort of periphery people who her immunity spread to initially, they drop off her net. So she has a limited number of people that she can spread her immunity to as an E. Thus, they begin to form this plan of how they can keep people safe. And they end up calling it the honeycomb protocol because it literally looks like a honeycomb where at the center you have an empath, and then all the people around them, and then the people who are connected to those people have some level of immunity, and then it spreads out until you reach sort of the limit for that E. And then it's up to the next E to protect the other people around them. And so they work out why there were so many E's in the net. It was because they provided sort of this immunity to this psychic illness, so to speak. Caleb wants Ivy to represent the E's on the ruling coalition, which is sort of the Psy ruling group currently. When she gets this offer, Aiden also suggests that Ivy sets up an E-Psy union because the E's are going to be doing a lot of work, and also she's not going to be treated as an equal member of this ruling coalition. She's not a leader, she's there as sort of a consultant, and he thinks that she needs to set it up so that she has a really strong standpoint where she's actually representing a group of people. And so that all happens, and she is eventually nominated, what's the name of it, as the president of the Empathic Collective. And that sort of happens towards the end of the book. And then they also have this other little subgroup that they call Psy Central, which includes Sahara, Sasha and Ivy as people who are the sort of the go-to heads of working with the empaths, which is great because you have 3 very strong female characters leading this group. So then we go back to Vasik's storyline with his gauntlet that's basically going critical. At this point, Samuel Rain is still quite chaotic. He's been trying to work on the problem, but you know, no one's able to get through to him or talk to him because he's just very focused on trying to figure this out and he hasn't got an answer yet. So while this is all happening, Vasik begins to make amends. So he's beginning to regret all the lives that he took as an arrow, as an assassin, and so he's trying to make amends with that. He and Ivy then move into her cabin on her family's farm. It becomes a place where arrows drop into all the time because it's a calm place, they're considered family, and it's safe. And then they get the word that Samuel has decided that he thinks that he can remove the gauntlet without killing Vasik. And while they're waiting for Vasik to come through his surgery, Aiden tells Ivy the story of how they met because Vasik was a very hard to control Psy child and he needed socialization, but he basically rejected and scared off all of the other Psy children that were put into the same room with him. And Aiden, who is the son of 2 Psy, was very calm and a bit stubborn, and so they put him in the room with Vasik as sort of a last-ditch effort. Aiden wasn't scared off so easily from Vasik, and he kept coming back, and eventually Vasik began to thaw and the two became thick as thieves. So we sort of get their backstory, which was a really nice and very, very sweet and a really good story to show why the two have this incredible bond and why they're such good friends. Vasik comes through the surgery, however he's lost his arm as a result, so they removed his arm in order to prevent him from losing his life. And after this, Zyzen ends up giving Vasik his wedding rings, so his wedding ring and Sunny's wedding ring, and Vasik ends up giving one of them to Ivy. And then at the very end of the story, Vasik and Ivy marry while their friends watch, and we find out that because the E's are now considered a very strong separate subgroup of the Psy, the arrows have aligned themselves with the E's, so their job now is to protect the E-Psy, and it's just a beautiful wrap up to that story. Then we come to some world things, and I included most of them in the story because it does impact on it, but there were some other things that I pulled out that were interesting from the world building perspective but didn't necessarily impact significantly on the main plot. So a lot of the chapters in this book open with the Code of the Arrows, which is sort of like their guiding principles. So we begin to get a little bit more of a deeper insight into the arrows, which was really fascinating because they've always been considered this separate group, this very dark, ominous, shadowy organization within the Psy. But in truth, all of their codes are related to trusting in their fellow arrows and following orders and working for the betterment of the Psy. And all of that sort of gets twisted along the way by depending on who is leading the group. Caleb also meets with Dev to discuss the Shadow Net, which is the net for the forgotten. And they talk about the disease in the normal net as well as the Shadow Net and how it functions. And then at the very end, Caleb declares peace between the Forgotten and the Psy. Reading between the lines, they're actively going to be working towards sort of this peace between the two groups that have been at odds for 100 years. So we know that Aiden and Vasik have had this underground movement within the Arrows where they've found people who were unhappy with how Ming was running the group and took issue with drugging the Arrows with Jax and with some of the missions that they were undertaking. And so they've sort of got this mini coup that has been on the back burner. And we find out that Aiden initially had wanted to approach Judd, especially when Judd managed to wean himself off Jax, but they hesitated in asking him because he appeared to be the perfect Psy because Judd was hiding his intentions the entire time. So that's why Judd wasn't initially part of Aiden and Vasik's group of renegade arrows. We find out that Hawk has a plan to eliminate Ming. However, Caleb at one point asks him to hold off from this because while there are all these outbreaks going on, Ming is actually maintaining some stability, I think, in Europe. It's not about not taking him out, but it is about choosing the right time to do it, especially when things are so critical for the Psy at the moment. So Hawk is frustrated, but he does listen to reason. And we also find out that Ming is really frustrated that he's lost control of the Arrows, but mostly he's frustrated that he's lost control of Vasik, and he has sort of plans to get Vasic back and to use Jax to make that happen. Oh, sorry, one of the attacks on Ivy and Vasic in the story is because of Ming. Ming's trying to get him back. Obviously, it fails because Vasic and Ivy are awesome. Caleb and Sahara are really sort of the political face now of the Psy. So there is the ruling coalition, which includes Anthony and Nikita and Caleb, but basically Caleb is a dictator and Sahara is his advisor. And look, to be honest, it's working really well. She offers him very good advice. She keeps him in check. He at one point is really concerned that she's only staying with him because she doesn't want him to go off the deep end, but she reassures him that that's not the case. And she's also the one to suggest to him that instead of just giving the arrows all the jobs that involve them killing people, that he actually gives them jobs where they are seen to, in a really positive light, as to be helping people and to raise the profile that way. At one point, Caleb walks in on Nikita and Anthony and it looks like they're in the middle of an argument. They're trying to discuss how they're going to sort of contain the news in the net. And Nikita suggests that Anthony's Night Star group of Foreseers release a statement that the future, that everything is good. Everything's going to be fine. And Anthony is very unhappy with this because he doesn't want to stake his group's reputation on a lie. And Caleb is just thinking that this sounds like a really old argument, which makes us question how much time have Nikita and Anthony been spending with one another. I am waiting for their book. I just want their story so badly. Sasha is continuing to meet with Alice, who is still trying to remember all of the things about her research that she's forgotten. And at one point, Sasha and Alice end up in New York City together with Ivy and Vasic. And Alice does begin to remember certain things. She's able to give advice. She's not entirely sure how she remembers it or why it's important, but she's able to offer some advice that is very helpful. We also meet another changeling group in New York, the Eagles, who are called Water Sky. They're sort of just in it really briefly, but they are mentioned. And we also find out that the Arrows, who are in Venice, who we met in Tangle of Need, are interested in becoming a more active part of the Arrow group now, especially with everything that's going on. So that becomes a big part of the next book. And then for my fun things, we find out that Vasic is really uneasy around empaths. It's like a prickle under his skin, mostly because the Arrows have been conditioned for silence so efficiently, and E's really unravel that. So he can always tell when he's around an E because it's just very uncomfortable for him. And it takes him a while to get used to that sensation, particularly when he's spending more time with them. I just loved seeing all of our Sahara and Caleb scenes because a bit like with Kiss of Snow, where the next book had significant scenes with Hawke and Sienna to continue that storyline, we sort of get that in this book where we do see Sahara and Caleb, not as much as probably we saw Hawke and Sienna in Tangle of Need, but we do see them quite a lot, and it's a lot to do with the political machinations and the advice that Sahara is giving to Caleb and being his sounding board. And I just thought that was brilliant because they're a really interesting couple in this world because of the way that Caleb is. Ivy is obsessed with Turkish Delight, so much so that Vasic ends up buying some for her. I think at one point she needs to tell him to stop buying her Turkish Delight because she just keeps eating it. There's a really nice scene where we see how much Vasic values the E's, and he basically considers them warriors for the Psy-Net. So they're the group of Psy who actually fight for the safety and the health of the Psy-Net. And it was just a beautiful way to talk about the role of the E's. And also we have a little scene where Sasha and Naya, so Sasha's daughter Naya, are visiting the Snowdancer territory when she's going to see Alice. And there's mention of the fact that Naya's favourite toy is a wolf plushie that Hawke gave her, and it drives Lucas absolutely insane that his daughter, a leopard changeling, is obsessed with a wolf toy, and it's great. That little thing just brings me so much joy because you also know that Hawke will hold that over Lucas for all of time. So that is my recap and discussion-y thoughts around Shield of Winter. It's a lot. I don't know how much of that made sense, but hopefully it did. I really enjoyed rereading the story. I'm looking forward to rereading Shards of Hope, which is also really long, so I need to mentally prepare myself for that one. In the comments below, feel free to have a chat to me about this book. Let me know your thoughts. I would love to hear them. Don't forget, all of the links for the live show and the read along are down below. I will have my next Psy-Changeling video up as soon as I read the book. If you want to let me know that you were here but you don't want to leave a comment, feel free to leave me a snowflake emoji because, you know, winter's in this title. Otherwise, I hope that wherever you are in the world, you're staying safe and healthy, and I'll see you in my next video. Thanks so much for watching. Bye everyone.